Ooh, what have we got here? New Sonos speakers right after a brand new HomePod was launched. This is going to be interesting. I remember the early days of Sonos. It involved things like this, which is a Play 1, excuse the terrible appearance of it, but back then you needed stuff like this and these things that were bridges, which worked, but you had to be really committed and it wasn't cheap either. However, those days are long gone and a new era, literally, of Sonos products is upon us. In fact, it's here now and we have the Era 100 and the Era 300, and more importantly, these products have come out right after we've had a brand new HomePod from Apple. But I have been using these over the last 2 days, and it's really interesting. Right, some specs. So these two speakers replace the Sonos One and the Sonos 5. And they both feature a brand new design. They've got a brand new touch interface with capacitive controls for volume and lots of other things. They've also got Apple AirPlay 2 support, Bluetooth 5. They retain the auxiliary in for external audio sources, although you do need an adapter now for that. They've also got expanded TruePlay, which optimizes the sound based on the room's acoustics. And they're the most sustainable speakers Sonos have made to date. They also support Wi-Fi 6, they come in black and white, and they have Alexa built in. Alexa, turn on the studio.
Okay.
The Era 100 replaces the Sonos One, and Sonos tells us this reinvents a category-leading icon, which is a fair thing to say, I think, really, because the Sonos One is a really popular home speaker, and it's fantastic. So the Era 100 has got a lot to live up to. And for the first time, the Era 100 provides stereo sound. It is more expensive than the One, though, so the Era 100 is £249, whereas the Sonos One is £179. The Era 300 replaces the Sonos 5, which again is a very popular speaker, and the specs are pretty impressive. It's got 6 Class D amps, it's got 4 tweeters, some of which are angled to support Dolby Atmos, and it also has 2 woofers. But one thing it has over the 100 is that it supports spatial audio. Oh, and I forgot to mention in that bit that the Era 300 is £449. Let's talk about design quickly. It's very subjective, obviously, but I really like these new Sonos speakers. You can place this anywhere and it will work perfectly, I think. And the Era 300 is a bit of a beast, admittedly. I like it. I love this design. It looks very premium and they're very well built. One of the best things about Sonos speakers is that they're built like tanks. The only thing I would say, as I mentioned earlier, these do come in white and black, and the black versions that you see here are very smudgy. These ones are covered in smudges already. I know you don't touch them too much, but they do have these touch capacitive controls, which, by the way, work really well. But just bear in mind that you might need a microfiber cloth for the black version. In terms of setup, it's pretty straightforward. You just plug them in, download the app on your phone, and follow the instructions, basically. Now, the Era 100 went by without any hassle whatsoever. Era 300 was a bit of a pain for some reason. It didn't connect to Wi-Fi to begin with. I had to keep resetting it. I had to reset my router. If everything goes like this install did, you're fine, but just bear in mind that you might need to do a bit of resetting occasionally just to get them up and running. But once they're up and running, they are rock solid. They both have TruePlay tuning capabilities, so that's a way of the EQ being adapted for the room. 2 options with this now. Either you press a button and it's done straight away, or if you want a more accurate setup, you do this thing where you get your phone and you wander around the room and move it up and down. It's worth doing. I mean, I didn't listen to them before I did that, so I couldn't tell what the difference was, but it takes 5 minutes per speaker, and if it gives a better sound, it's worth doing, even if you look like a bit of an idiot. And the rest of the setup was really easy. I added all of my services. By the way, the list of services that you can add to Sonos these days is ridiculous. It goes on and on. Although you're spending a lot of money on this stuff, you are getting a lot for it. Right, on to the thing that you really care about. How do these things sound? Well, yesterday, after I got them set up, I had a first listen, and this is what happened. I did this with the new HomePod. I unboxed it and then listened to it, and then you watched my reaction, which hopefully was interesting. I'm going to do that with the Era 300 now, and then the Era 100. I can't play you back what I'm listening to because of copyright and stuff, but basically it's Peter Gabriel, Sledgehammer, and it's my kind of test track for anything, really. So here we go. I'll play some comical music while I'm doing this. It's loud. It's really loud. Something to note here, when I did the same test with the HomePod, I was listening to it wrong. I was sitting there like this. You don't do that with speakers like the Era 300 and the HomePod because they're designed to just fill the room. And the idea is you put them down and forget about them and go off and do your thing. But wasn't any distortion. It's not as, compared to the HomePod, it wasn't quite as deep bass-wise. But equally, the issue that I've had with the new HomePod is that it feels like it's distorting. A lot of the bottom end stuff feels a little bit flabby at times. That didn't then. That felt nice and tight, nice and punchy, and like I say, very, very loud. That went uncomfortably loud then. But let's go and have a listen to the Era 100. Okay, time for the little one. So I'm very used to the Sonos One. That's a fantastic sounding speaker, always was. How does this compare? So again, Peter Gabriel, give me your best shot, and here's some random music for you guys. Weirdly, that was more impressive than the 300 for some reason. I think because I'm always impressed when small speakers sound big, and Sonos has always managed that. They've always managed to make these tiny things sound very impressive. And that sounds incredible. I was really impressed with that. The bass was nice and tight, lots of top end, very loud. When I cranked it up on that, it got, again, uncomfortably loud. Again, I'm way too close to it. No one listens to Sonos speakers like this, but that's not the point. I'm gonna go and get some sleep, and I'm gonna come back tomorrow and do a proper listen. When I click my fingers, it will be tomorrow. Magic. I have had a more detailed listen to these two, and they're fantastic. If you've ever heard a Sonos speaker before, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about here. When I first heard the Play 1, I was knocked back by the amount of sound coming out of it. These two step it up a gear massively. The stereo sound in both of them, although you're not going to sit there listening to it like that, is impressive. It seems to give you a much wider soundstage throughout the room, and I think the spatial audio in the Era 300 makes a huge difference. It does fill the room completely. You can't quite tell where the music's coming from, but you can hear it. And there's two things that really impress me with these speakers. The first one is the volume. As you saw in those first listens, the sheer noise these things can make without distorting, and they do some very clever thing with EQ where as you turn them up, it's definitely reducing the bass a little bit to, you know, prevent any kind of flabbiness and distortion. You'll have no problem, trust me, no matter the size of your room, filling your house with sound. And if you've got a party or something like that, these will just rock it. There's no problem at all. This is quite a big room. This studio floor is quite big, and this feels too big for it. Now, the only thing that I can't try at the moment, unfortunately, is the Dolby Atmos support for this, because I haven't got enough Sonos speakers to set up a surround sound system. And it's worth very quickly talking about the smarts that are built into these. So they both have access to Alexa, and they work perfectly as Echo speakers in their own right. But they also have something called Sonos Voice Control. It works very well. I love the guy that speaks on it. He seems to be very enthusiastic about your choices. Hey Sonos, play Fatboy Slim.
Sounds great.
But there's one question remaining. Are these new Era speakers better than what Apple has to offer? Well, firstly, we can't really include the Era 100 in this comparison because Apple doesn't make anything like this. This isn't in this part of the comparison. The Era 300, however, is. And that's because the nearest competitor for this is the new HomePod. When I spoke to Sonos, I asked them about the new HomePod coming out, and they were very confident, as you'd guess. They said, no, not really. We don't think too much about that. We know what we've built is fantastic. We'll let it speak for itself. And it really does. Now, the Era 300 is £150 more expensive than the new HomePod, but I think you get quite a lot for your money with that. Firstly, the sound is better on the Era 300 than the HomePod. I've mentioned this before, that the HomePod it sounds pretty good, to be fair, and it does fill the room, but I'm bothered about the bass response. It feels a bit flabby. Whereas with the Era 300, it's clear throughout the entire frequency range and it gets very loud. Secondly, the smarts. So again, you get Alexa built into the Era 300, which is just one of the best home assistants out there. And on the HomePod, you get Siri. We've been using Siri at home completely throughout the house, and it's really challenging. Siri is slow, she gets things wrong, she seems to get very confused when you ask for music to be played on certain HomePods. It's just a really frustrating experience. And this brings me to an inevitable conclusion about these two products. Sonos doesn't make cheap speakers. You do need a pretty big budget to afford this stuff, but you get an awful lot for your money. And if you want the best sounding, most convenient way of filling your entire house with sound, and you want the best possible, or one of the best home assistants built into it, there's nothing quite like this stuff. So a huge thumbs up for these if you've got the budget, but if you're still interested in what Apple has to offer, keep watching for a link to my latest HomePod review.